A frightening thing happened to me when I first became pastor of Community of Reconciliation, and it started with a question. Isn't that how many journeys begin? I asked the congregation at a small group gathering, what happens when we worship? The amazing thing is that I got back a lot of blank stares and looks. They looked at one another and off they went for a 45-minute small group discussion. Now this is the frightening part. When they came back, they said to me, we don't know what happens when we worship together. We need you to help us figure that out. We really didn't know what happens to us as a corporate community when we worship together at 11 o'clock. Some of us thought it was about fellowship. Others thought it was about us. Some thought it was about God. Some came for the music, others for the preaching, others for the singing. They said to me, we need you to help us figure it out. What is it exactly that we do when we come together as a people of God to worship? As a pastor, it never occurred to me that I would have to teach worship. Worship was something that I did instinctively. I don't think that they prepared me for this in seminary. Teaching a congregation about the corporate meaning of worship, what happens when this particular community of faith gathers together as a worshiping community, if I had to be honest, I would have to say that I was afraid. Thank God we serve a God who hears our prayers and answers them. A short time later, a colleague would show me an advertisement from Christian Century magazine advertising the Worship Renewals Grants program sponsored by the Calvin Institute on Christian Worship.
The Worship Renewal Grants program at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship is designed to foster well-grounded worship renewal in congregations throughout North America. Made possible through the generous support of Lilly Endowment, these grants are intended to serve a grassroots constituency of those concerned for the vitality of worship life in their local Christian communities of faith. Since its inception, the Worship Renewal Grants program has brought together leaders of Christian communities across North America to discover, dialogue, and discern new opportunities for renewing our faith through worship. They have supported projects representing dozens of denominations, including African American, Hispanic, and multi-ethnic churches. Through its grant-making, the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship intends to stimulate thoughtful and energetic work that will result in services of worship that exhibit renewed creativity, theological integrity, and relevance.
You see, Calvin Institute have figured out something very important that would prove to be significant. And that was, while we as Christians around this world have worship at the center of who we are and what we do, many of us have forgotten why we do what we do. And they discovered that if we would take the time to rediscover the deeper meaning and purpose of worship, that in fact, not only would we be renewed, but we would move into a more meaningful and lasting relationship with God. Today, as people make their way into our churches, they know less and less about the history of the church, our songs, our stories, our hymns. They don't know our rituals or our language. Today, faith gatherings are made up more and more of people who have no allegiance to what we do or why we do it. They are looking for things that have meaning for them in the here and now. If we are to be the church for all people at all times and places, then we must find the time, have the courage, and trust the Spirit enough to allow ourselves to be made new, even in the very midst of being the church. this is the story of our congregation's journey through worship renewal. At the heart of worship renewal is an acceptance and an acknowledgement that the place that we find ourselves is not the place we truly want to be. At the heart of worship renewal is a reaching for God, a reaching for something else that puts us in the very center of God, the place where life's aches cannot find us. At the heart of worship renewal is an acknowledgement that God's heart is the place we call home. And the journey of worship renewal is the journey of trying to get back home. The thought of worship renewal brings to mind something organic, and as such, it's difficult for us to know exactly how what we do manifests itself into the very thing we set out to accomplish. Nevertheless, here's what we did.
First of all, we wanted to implement the worship renewal in a way where we would get everybody involved, everybody in the congregation. So we wanted to make sure that everybody was involved from the beginning and was part of the decision in applying for the grant, and hence in the decision of implementing the grant. This worked out really well, but we did encounter challenges. One of the main ones was that we are a very, very diverse congregation, and of course a lot of people, we bring everybody on board, everybody has different ideas about what worship renewal is and what it means to us as our congregation. So the whole process led us into a time of discernment, and we entered into thinking about this, which led into reflection, and that led into prayer and openness, and eventually we opened our hearts and our minds to an attitude of transformation within our congregation. By the time we received the award, we were already in a place within our congregation where we had made a commitment to go forward with or without the grant. So it was the period of waiting where we really found out that we weren't really where we wanted to be, and we decided that we wanted to experience worship in a new way, in a new, renewed way of being transformed.
When we received the award, it brought about excitement. But claiming and receiving the award was much easier than the commitment it would take to see the award through. Leadership issues were still plaguing us because, you see, the need for worship renewal is usually a sign in our congregations that there are other places in need of renewal as well. We realized that it would be good to invite someone else to journey with us, and perhaps other congregations. This would add a different dimension to the process of worship renewal, and this group of people could hold us accountable. With the help and assistance of the Worship Renewal Grant that we were awarded, we invited Dr. Sarah Penstraw as our worship consultant to journey with us.
If you had to decide what would be the most important task for this group to do about worship renewal, or about renewal, what would it be? Just come up with an idea. I don't want you to think about priorities, just come up with what might work.
And don't think about
We had to determine that we would have to mix things up a bit, and as a congregation, we'd have to make, first of all, a commitment to want to renew our worship experience. And then we had to recruit a team that would be committed to guiding us and leading us in this worship renewal experience. And once we had the commitment of the congregation, then this worship renewal team was designated to go out and to visit other congregations to see how they worshiped and how it was meaningful to them. We got started. We found out that it was harder to recruit for the team, even though we had a great deal of excitement about the idea of having worship renewal be a part of our church. As soon as Sarah Penstraw, our consultant, came and met with us, we began to consider what our ideas of worship were and how they were related to the church, both now and in times past.
Sarah Penstraw led us in Bible study and discussion of many topical issues. She helped us choose churches to visit. She introduced us to different elements of worship, and we discussed all of those. And she helped us talk about our faith and our faith experiences in ways we never had before.
The team struggled with the obvious, although no one really realized what was happening. How was something organic going to grow out of these very ordinary things that we were doing? People became frustrated and didn't know which direction to turn.
Sarah was invaluable. Her teaching, her leading, reflecting, centering on God's Word for the answers was just what we needed. But we were still stuck. A cultural, a paradigm shift had to take place, and a commitment to real renewal, because we really didn't know where we were going. We didn't understand it where we were at the time. Some people stopped coming to meetings. Some people didn't show up for visits. It seemed like they thought maybe other things were more important than the worship renewal team. But maybe we were really afraid. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't have an understanding because we hadn't gotten to the level we needed to be at yet.
In hindsight, I'm certain that I was afraid to take the deep breath and say what needed to be said, to put it all on the line. But when things get bad enough, you do, and I did. I called the team together, and I asked the group, should we send the money back to Calvin Institute and tell them that this is just not the right time? And then something happened. One of the members of the group, a newer member to our congregation, who had been feeling very disappointed in what we had accomplished, he asked a question that turned out to be the most important question asked during our year-long experience. He asked us, he said, how will we know? How will we know if worship has been renewed at Community of Reconciliation? He shared with us that he had been contemplating this question for a while. The answer, it seemed, would prove to be more than obvious and very important. we realized was that worship renewal would happen for our congregation when it happened for each and every one of us. Until that point, we were thinking about worship renewal outside of ourselves, as something that would happen to the congregation, but not to each one of us. Until that moment, we hadn't realized it, but each member of the team had unspoken expectations. It was almost as if we expected that every time the renewal team gathered together or went out to visit another congregation, that something would change in our congregation. We began to realize that as we moved into a deeper relationship with God ourselves, so our worship would also become renewed. At the heart of worship renewal is an acceptance and an acknowledgement that the place that we find ourselves is not the place we truly want to be. At the heart of worship renewal is a reaching for God, a reaching for something else that puts us in the very center of God, the place where life's aches cannot find us. At the heart of worship renewal is an acknowledgement that God's heart is the place we call home. And the journey of worship renewal is the journey of trying to get back home. Embracing worship renewal has become the catalyst for everything we do as a congregation. The energy and enthusiasm of the worship renewal team has become an inspiration for all that we do as a congregation. If I was ever a doubter of the power of the small group, I would now be a believer. Worship renewal team has in fact reached for something deeper. They've reached into the very heart of God and called it home. Specifically, our worship is more vibrant and people are involved. There is a new openness to change and exploration with the Spirit. This past summer, we started a new worship service, a Saturday evening worship service, and our Sunday mornings were led by 2 members of the laity of our congregation. This fall, we added a midweek break for those who work in our community. And we have just implemented a new design for ministry that is geared to involve everyone in our congregation and broaden our outreach into the community. We are building spiritual energy, and we now want to be known as the church where every member is in ministry. Nearly every place that change is happening in our congregation, a worship renewal team member is an integral part of it. They have been a major influence in moving us from the place that we were to the place that God is calling us to be. As a congregation, our communication and the depth of our communication has been altered significantly. We now talk about the important things of our faith, like who we worship, why we worship, and how we worship. We talk about the deeper meaning and purpose of what it means to be God's people. To God be the glory, for we are finding our way home.